It happened before sunrise in a room where papal decisions were normally measured in directive councils and carefully worded declarations. But that morning, Pope Leo did the first thing on the agenda. Protocol with a single sentence. "Bring me Tiberius." The words hung in the air like incense. His secretary blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Holy Father," the dog Srini repeated. "Leo eyes, bring him here to the apostolic palace." No one moved, not out of disobedience but out of surprise. The Vatican had been holding its breath ever since Leo had quietly disappeared from Santa Maria Maggiore the night before. Rumors swirled. Some claimed he knelt beside the tomb of Francis. Others said he returned with red eyes and heavy breathing. But no one knew the truth. And now a pope demanded a dog. Should I arrange a private room for him? Component placement? The secretary whispered carefully. No, Leo replied. He rose slowly. I will receive him publicly. Let the world see. The secretary's eyes widened. Leo placed his hands on the desk and said, Tell the guards, tell the press, tell it. People will meet on the steps. St. Peter's Basilica. And what should we say? What it means? Component placement? She asked in a trembling voice. Leo smiled. We won't say anything. Let them find the meaning themselves. By mid-morning, the news had spread throughout the Vatican. Whispers were circulating among the Swiss guards. The press office received a brief message. The Holy Father demanded that Tiberius be taken to St. Peter's Square before noon. No further instructions, no statement. But everyone in the Vatican knew something significant was about to happen. A single van was dispatched to Santa Maria Maggiore. There, Tiberius waited. He had spent the entire night beside the tomb, without food or comfort. His fur was ruffled, his eyes full of unwavering loyalty. As the dog handlers approached, they expected resistance. But Tiberius stood up, didn't growl, didn't retreat. He just looked at them as if to say, I know where I'm going. Without a leash, without a collar, he jumped into the car and calmly curled up. There was no trace of hesitation in his demeanor, only quiet determination. Even the priests who had cared for him so far stood motionless. Pope Leo XII, meanwhile, stood on the balcony of the Apostolic Palace and watched the preparations. He leaned on the railing. You will expect an explanation, he murmured. But I will give you a moment that is not about power or doctrine, but about the quiet strength of a heart that chooses love. The van reached the border of Vatican City while camera crews were already gathering. Headlines spread worldwide. Pope Leo X calls Francis's dog to him. Papal gesture or mystical ceremony. All over Rome, people paused, looked at screens, and listened to the radio. Some laughed, others cried. No one remained indifferent at airports, in cafes, at bus stops. Everywhere, eyes were turned to the screens. Even in remote monasteries, transistor radios hummed softly. In St. Peter's Square, gathered not tourists but locals. Romans who had seen many popes come and go sensed this was different. No hymns, no procession, just reverential silence. Then a clear toll of the bell. The bronze doors of St. Peter's Basilica opened. Pope Leo stepped out alone, without guards. He looked not with authority but with gentleness at the crowd. It was as if he didn't want to lead, but to accompany. The van held Tiberius, sitting upright, looking calmly out the window. When the door opened, he got out. Not rushed, not forced, as if the place had belonged to him since time immemorial. The breath of Rome caught. For a moment, Tiberius stood still. Then he began to walk. Not toward the camera, not toward the crowd, but toward Leo. Step by step, with the calmness of a being who knows his purpose. Leo didn't move. As Tiberius reached the steps, the Pope began to descend slowly, step by step, his robe like a wave behind him. As they stood facing each other, Leo whispered, You were waiting for him. Would you wait for me too? Tiberius gently laid his head on Leo's knee. The crowd held its breath. Then Leo knelt and put his arms around the animal that had shown what true loyalty meant. For a moment, it was as if time had held its breath, as if heaven and earth had come closer together. And right there on those steps a truth became visible that needed no words. The throne of the church begins not with power but with humility. What the world saw that day on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica was not a spectacle. It was a confession. But the real wound. It happened in secret, far from the cameras. Tiberius was now not just a dog but a silent companion in the hallowed halls of the Apostolic Palace. No one talked about it, but everyone knew. The Pope had not only welcomed him, he had recognized him. The palace staff treated Tiberius with silent respect. The gardeners greeted him as if he were walking on a familiar thread. The cooks placed a bowl of water in a quiet corner of the kitchen, and even the silent Swiss guards occasionally nodded to him. He disturbed no one, demanded nothing, but his presence changed something. The air in the palace had become different. Where once only devotion and duty reigned, something soft now moved in. A touch of familiarity, of quiet closeness. Leo watched this with silent admiration. He began to include Tiberius in his daily rituals. When he prayed, the dog sat quietly beside him. When he read, Tiberius lay down at his feet. It was as if the Pope had found an anchor through this companion, silent mirror in which he understood himself better. At evening mass, Tiberius was sometimes there on the sidelines, not in the center but always there. Living shadow that provided comfort with his mere presence. Evening, Leo stood in front of the window of his study and looked out at the dark St. Peter's Square. Tiberius lay on the carpet, his eyes half closed. "They expect much from me," the Pope said, quietly. "They want answers, guidelines, security. But sometimes I wish I could give them only what you give me: closeness, silence, trust." Tiberius briefly raised his head as if he had understood, and then laid it back on his paws. Leo smiled weakly and turned away from the window. He sat down at his desk and began to write. Not an encyclical, not an official statement, but thoughts. Personal reflections on grace, on weakness, on the quiet ways of God. And sometimes, he admitted to himself, he even wrote letters to Francis, not to send them, but to feel close to his predecessor. The next morning, as the sun bathed Rome in golden light, Leo entered the courtyard with Tiberius. A few nuns tending the garden paused briefly and lowered their gaze. The Pope nodded to them kindly, then slowly continued on. Tiberius followed him with measured steps, always half a meter behind him. It was an image that remained in his memory. A man in white, followed by a silent guard. A moment that said more than 1,000 words. In the days that followed, Leo felt a change within himself. He spoke more consciously, listened more attentively. In conversations with cardinals, he placed more value on compassion than on dogma. He often asked, "How are you really doing?" instead of "What is your opinion?" It was as if the encounter with Tiberius had taught him a different language, a language of the heart. Even at official occasions, his tone was gentler, his demeanor more open to humanity. But not everyone was enthusiastic. In some circles, people whispered about the dog Pope. Some found it inappropriate that an animal had such closeness to the Holy Father. An anonymous letter that landed in his office stated, "The dignity of the office requires distance. Confidentiality is not to be confused with closeness." Others wondered if Leo was too soft, too receptive, too vulnerable. Leo folded the paper without saying a word and put it aside. He went to Tiberius, who was lying in the corner, and sat down next to him on the floor. "Perhaps you've changed more than I thought," he murmured. "Perhaps your presence reminds us that closeness is not a weakness, that touch heals, even when it occurs in silence." That evening, Leo skipped evening prayer. Instead, he walked with Tiberius through the palace corridors, past centuries-old frescoes, silent chapels, and empty hallways. It wasn't an official tour, but a silent stroll. And somewhere between the shadows and the light of the late evening, it became clear, the church was changing not through declaration, but through attitude, not through regulations, but through presence. And in this change, a dog was the silent witness of a pope who was learning to lead with his heart. The months passed, and Tiberius remained a constant companion at Leo's side. 14 Where loneliness and duty had once reigned, a silent community had now grown. The palace was no longer a place of cold representation, but became a space of lived closeness. Even the cardinals, initially skeptical, began to understand the nature of this change. Not rationally, but intuitively, in silent gestures, in the quieter tone, in pauses that made room for genuine listening. The old walls breathed a new form of but with this came new challenges. The world outside was unrestful. Conflicts flared up, old wounds opened, and the call for a clear, strong voice grew louder. The press, politics, and parts of the electorate pushed for a public stance. But Leo remained silent. He relied not on speeches but on signs. Tiberius increasingly became one of these signs of loyalty, patience, and presence, for a faith that speaks through actions and not through volume. When a particularly harsh letter arrived from the diplomatic choir accusing Leo of making the church appear powerless, the Pope took note of it but remained silent. That night he wrote in his notebook, "Perhaps strength is not what we show but what we carry." It was an insight born of silence and pain, from the awareness that true leadership doesn't have to be loud. Tiberius lay at his feet as he often did. The Pope stroked his fur. "We lead together, old friend. You say nothing, and yet you teach me every day. Perhaps you are the best preacher of us both." A few weeks later, a little girl came to the general audience with her mother. The mother was sick, marked by chemotherapy. The child carried a faded stuffed animal, a dog with worn ears. After the audience, the child was desperate to see the Pope. When Leo leaned down to her, she said, "I also have a Tiberius. He watches over me when Mommy is asleep." Leo looked at her for a long time, then beckoned to one of the staff members. Tiberius was in a quiet side area of the audience hall. When the dog was brought, he walked slowly, almost solemnly, to the child and lay down next to her. She stroked him and said nothing more, but her eyes shone and her mother's eyes filled with tears. A simple encounter and yet holier than many ceremonies. In the days following this encounter, something changed in Leo. He became quieter but not weaker. It was the silence of a person who had deeply understood something. That grace was not just a theological category but a living, breathing reality, and that this grace often shone forth in those moments when no one was looking, in a look, gesture, a silence that was not empty but full. He began to explain less in his daily sermons and to testify more. Tiberius grew older, his steps slower, his sleep deeper, but his gaze remained clear. Leo watched over him like a brother. When the day came that Tiberius could no longer get up, Leo left everything else behind. No appointments, no obligation. He knelt beside him, laid a blanket over him, and whispered, "You waited for him. You waited for me. Now I'm waiting with you. I'm not leaving." Tiberius died that night, quietly, without pain. Leo stayed by his side until morning. The dog was buried in the garden of the Apostolic Palace, in a place that would never appear in a guidebook. Only a simple plaque with the name Tiberius, faithful friend. No cameras, no announcement, no obituary, just earth, prayer and remembrance, and the deep knowledge that something precious had ended. The next day, Leo entered the chapel alone. He didn't hold mass, didn't give a sermon. He simply sat quietly in the front pew and folded his hands. And whoever saw him understood. Something had ended and something new had begun. In the silence, in the memory, and in the firm resolve never to forget what truly matters: closeness, faithful grace. He sat there for a long time, while the light fell through the colored windows and the day slowly dawned. Thus, not only a chapter in the history of a pontificate ended, but a testimony was born. Given, one that was quieter than words but louder than any proclamation. And somewhere in the depths of the church's heart remained the image of a man in white, an old dog, and a promise never spoken but forever kept. And if it were ever asked what true greatness was, perhaps the answer would be, to love without demanding, to stay without hesitation, to lead without exalting oneself above others.